Hello there everyone, Lisa Tilson here today to share this card with you. I'm going to be making this card using a couple of new products from the Hero Arts My Monthly Hero release, which is February 2022. So we're going to be creating this Follow Your Dreams card using the Star Wreath Fancy die, which is here on the left, and the Dream Messages stamp set on the right. So I'm going to start by die cutting the wreath, and I'm going to cut it once from white glitter cardstock. All the supplies are going to be listed below in the description bar, and I'm also going to be cutting it 3 times from £110 white cardstock. It's a really pretty white cardstock. In the pack you actually get some black as well, so this is the Hero Arts Glitter Basics. And so I'm just popping that out there. It die cuts really easily. I run it through the die cutting machine a couple of times, and I'm just going to use the craft pick here just to pop out all those little sections, and I will be saving the white glitter stars for later on in the video. And whilst I was die cutting, I also cut out another half of the wreath. This is from the glitter cardstock, because I'm actually going to be trimming out some of those smaller stars to use as embellishments later on the card. So here are all my die cuts ready to be glued together. The 1.5 there on the right is from the white glitter cardstock, and here on the left I've got the 3 die cuts which I cut from white cardstock. Now 2 of them are already adhered together, so I'm just adding tiny dabs of glue all around the wreath on the 3rd one so that I can add that into the stack. You could use stick it adhesive or something when you cut the die cuts out, but I prefer to add wet adhesive on, as this does give you a little bit of wiggle room when you're trying to put the stack together. I do apologise if you can hear any background noise. We are in the middle of a storm here in the UK, and the wind is howling around my craft rooms, so not ideal times to do a voiceover, but needs must. So I'm just pressing that firmly down, and then I'm just going to put that back down onto the craft mat, and I'm then going to go ahead and add the white glitter die cut on top. So just following the same process and adding tiny dabs of glue all the way around the wreath. And it really doesn't take long to do all these layers, and because I end up with 4 layers, 3 of them with £110, you do get a really solid stack by the time you've adhered them all together, and it looks fantastic on the final card. It really kind of holds its shape and stands up well, so it's definitely worth doing. And I'm just going to pop an acrylic block on now whilst it's drying. We're going to move on to the stripes now, and I've got 4 different coloured cardstocks here from Concord in 9th. I've got Midnight, Sea Glass, Aqua Sky and Oceanside, and I've also got a panel of white, and I'm going to die cut each of them with this Colour Blocks Stripes die from Pinkfresh Studio. You could easily cut them with a trimmer, but I like the kind of rounded edges you get when you use a die cut. So I actually have a whole bunch of these, which I'm going to show you in a second, already pre-cut. And I just keep them in a little plastic pocket so that I can reach for them whenever I need them. So apologies for the light there, it's going in and out today with the storm. So here are all my strips. I've got a couple of navy there as well. It's difficult to see them because of the glass mat, and I've also got a scrap piece of cardstock, so I'm just going to add some stick it adhesive sheet onto that now. That's going to enable me to adhere all my stripes down to that piece of cardstock. Just making sure that I've got that whole panel covered, and then I'm just going to go ahead and trim off the excess. So now it's time to start sticking these strips down. I'm just going to remove the backing sheet from the Stick It adhesive first. So that side of my panel is now completely covered in adhesive, and although my fingers do get stuck to it a little bit, you can leave some of the paper on so that you can kind of put your fingers on that and they don't end up with adhesive on them. But honestly, it really isn't a big problem for me. So I'm just going to line up the first of my strips, and this is a navy strip, and it's really important to get this first one right. If this one goes off kilter, all the rest will follow, and it's definitely visible to the eye. So you have to really make sure that first one goes down correctly, and all the remaining ones, as long as you butt them up really closely together, you'll end up with a beautifully striped panel. So just moving through the rest of the strips, I really like these pretty colours. I thought they would make a nice contrast against the black card that I add this panel onto. So just finishing up there with a final navy strip, and there's 6 in total, and I'm just going to now go ahead and trim off all of that excess cardstock that I'm not going to need, and I cut this panel down to 4 1/4 wide. And I'm taking my bone folder here and just making sure that all of those strips are really pressed down onto that cardstock. And as I have added these 2 white cardstock and trimmed it out, I wanted to make sure that the edges looked really neat. You can see the white cardstock around the edges, so I just took a black Copic marker and I went round all 4 of the edges, and I just added some black so you don't see any of that white cardstock on my final finished card. I've now taken an A2 panel of Hero Art's pitch black cardstock, and I'm just working out where I want those stripes to be. So I've grabbed the Star Wreath just to make sure that everything is positioned in the right place, and I'm just going to add a little bit of low tack tape. Sorry, that moves out of the camera a little bit. I'm just going to put that down there, and I use that as a little hinge. So I'm just going to flip it back on itself, add the wet adhesive on, and then flip it back down, and that way I know it's in exactly the right position on that final panel. Just making sure that that's all lined up at the sides, and I'm going to take a T-square ruler here just to make sure that is completely straight on my black cardstock, and it is, so I can then go ahead and remove that low tack tape, and that finishes that part of the card. So now I want to add a few splatters on around those stripes. I've taken a very small acrylic block here and some Winsor & Newton white gouache. I'm just going to add a tiny little dab of that onto the block. So this is what I'm going to use for my white splatter on the card, which I want to look like stars in the sky. So just to loosen that up a little bit, I'm going to take a spray and just add a tiny bit of water just to make sure I can get that moving so that it's going to be nice and wet before I add the splatters onto the panel. I've put the panel into my splat box, and I'm just going to cover up those stripes by adding a little bit of scratch paper. Apologies for my head getting in the way there. I wanted to make sure that the stripes were all hidden behind that scrap paper. And then I'm just going to take the acrylic block and a very small round brush, and I've added the paint onto that, and I'm just going to splatter that over the top right hand portion of the panel. So I'm really sorry about the light here. It's very difficult when something's in the actual box to be able to see it. So I flip that around, I add another little bit of scrap paper on top of the stripes again, and then I just go ahead and add some more splatters to the bottom left hand side of that cardstock. You never quite know what you're going to get when you add splatters to a panel, and for some reason the paint didn't want to come off, but it does in the end come off, and I do manage to finish off that bottom side of the panel. And now it's time to add our wreath on top, so just adding tiny dabs of glue all the way around the wreath so that I can add it onto the stripes. And I use some tweezers to help me position that down, and I really like how it looks in the end. I think it looks really pretty against the black background. And just pressing that down firmly just to make sure that it's all stuck properly and isn't going to move anywhere. And now it's time for me to add on a few of the little stars that I cut earlier from that tiny bit of extra wreath from the white glitter cardstock. So I've got 4 stars here, and I'm going to add 2 in the top right and 2 in the bottom left. I think adding the stars adds a little bit more movement to the card. We're now going to work on our sentiments, so I'm taking the Dream Messages set and I'm going to use the Follow Your Dreams sentiment. So I've popped a bit of black cardstock into my Misty, and I'm going to prep that with an anti-static powder bag. This will just make sure that I don't get any excess powder where I don't want it. So I'm adding some Versamark ink to the stamp which I've picked up onto the lid of the Misty, and I'm just going to press that down onto the cardstock. I'm adding some white detail embossing powder, and then I'm going to heat set that up off camera. And now that the sentiment has been heat embossed, I'm going to trim that down using a Simon Says Stamp sentiment label die. So just making sure that that's on straight, adding some low tack tape, and I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine. Now that that's die cut, I'm just going to take that out of the die, and I'm going to pop the whole thing into my trimmer and just cut off the excess from the sides. And I've added a little bit of foam tape onto the left hand side of the sentiment, and onto the right hand side I'm going to add some glue. Because this is going to span both the wreath and the panel, one side of the sentiment is higher than the other, so the bit where I've added the glue is actually going to sit onto the star wreath. So just lining that up now with my tweezers before I press that down firmly into place. All that remains now is for me to add this to a note card. So I'm just going to add some adhesive onto the back of this panel, and I'm adding it onto a note card that I've created from Hero Art's Pitch Black cardstock. So I'm just pressing that down, and that brings us to the end of the card. So I hope that you've enjoyed watching it come together today. As I mentioned earlier, all the supplies that I've used are in the description bar below, and all details are also over on my blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.